Good morning, evening, or afternoon. Today we conclude the week dedicated to Flavius Josephus. For the time being, there's so much more we still have to see in Flavius Josephus. But today we're going to look at chapter 6 of the first volume of Flavius Josephus' story into meditating what happened at the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament. How is it that the Persian Empire or the Maccabee kingdom suddenly becomes the Roman Empire in the New Testament? That needs to be filled out. That's why sola scriptura is false. And if it's the Catholic Bible, how did it transfer from the Maccabees to the Romans? That's what we are looking at today, and that's why Flavius Josephus is so important. Para dejarles saber desde ahora, la edición de hoy va a ser una edición bilingüe. Perdón, no bilingüe, sigo en inglés. Perdón por mi error. Hoy vamos a continuar viendo la historia de Flavio Josefo, que es importante conocer. Repito, no basta ser un estudioso de la Biblia diciéndose que es sola escritura, porque no se pueden conocer bien. Hay muchas cosas que tienen que rellenarse como para saber cómo es que el imperio persa en tiempo de Esther de repente se convierte en el imperio romano, o el reino de los Macabeos de repente se convierte en el imperio romano. Hay que rellenar y cubrir varios huecos, y por eso estudiamos Flavio Josefo. Este episodio ya lo he dado en inglés, aquí abajo está el enlace, pero ya lo subí una vez en español, abajo está el enlace para los que quieran estar al tanto del contenido en español. Saludos a la Librería Guadalupe para Nuevo Amanecer. Now, let's continue. Yesterday, we left off with the death of Alexandra Salome, the wife of Alexander Jannaeus, from the house of the Maccabees, or the Hasmoneans, as they're also sometimes called. This was the fourth generation after the Maccabees. After the rise of the Maccabees, who freed Israel from being persecuted by the Syrian Greeks after the fall of Alexander the Great. But then, with the death of Alexandra Salome, a civil war broke out. She had two sons. One of them was called Hyrcanus II after the grandfather, and then the other one I called Aristobulus II after an uncle. Now, when Alexandra Salome dies, she leaves her son Hyrcanus II as king of Jerusalem, as the king of the Maccabee kingdom. However, he was only able to rule for 3 months. There was a major problem. One brother was supported by Pharisees. The other brother was supported by Sadducees. These two did not see eye to eye. They were at constant odds against each other. And this divided the family. And on the 3rd month of Hyrcanus' reign, a civil war breaks out. And that's what Flavius Josephus talks to us today about this civil war among the Maccabees. Now, without further ado, let's see what Flavius Josephus has to tell us about this war. We left off with chapter 6. Now, Hyrcanus was heir to the kingdom. Alexander Salome left the kingdom to his son, Hyrcanus II. And to him did his mother commit it before she died. But Aristobulus was superior to him in power and magnanimity. Remember that Hyrcanus supported one side, Hyrcanus tended to support the Pharisees along with his mother, but Aristobulus tended to support the Sadducees. The Pharisees, while Alexander Salome was still in power, the Pharisees wanted to get total control of the government, which later became known as the Sanhedrin. So a great persecution took place under Alexander Salome, guided by the Pharisees. These Pharisees then, with the authority of Alexander Salome, issued persecution against the Sadducees. These Sadducees would come to Aristobulus so that Aristobulus would speak up to them, would speak up for them. Aristobulus then would convince his mother, Alexander Salome, to exile them instead of killing them. Because the Pharisees and Alexander Salome wanted to destroy all traces of Sadduceeism. So these Sadducees rose to love Aristobulus, while the Pharisees rose to love Hyrcanus. Now, these Sadducees, who had been once in power and lost power under Alexander Salome, they loved Aristobulus. They hated Hyrcanus, and they came to the side with Aristobulus to help overthrow Hyrcanus. Mind you, Hyrcanus had only been king for 3 months. He had not had yet enough time to strengthen his hold of this kingdom he was inheriting. The Sadducees knew this, and they inspired Aristobulus to retake the kingdom. And when there was a battle between them to decide the dispute about the kingdom near Jericho, the greatest part deserted Hyrcanus and went over to Aristobulus. So Hyrcanus wasn't even liked as much, even by the Pharisees. So many of them switched over to Aristobulus. So Hyrcanus was betrayed, not only by his brother, but by many in his army as well. But Hyrcanus, with those of his party who stayed with him, fled to Antonia and got to his power the hostages that might for his preservation, which were Aristobulus' wife and her children, with her children. In other words, remember that right before her death, Queen Alexandra Salome had arrested Aristobulus' wife and kids to hold as hostages so that Aristobulus would give back the kingdom to Hyrcanus. However, this did not happen as much because, unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you want to see it, Alexandra Salome died before any deal could be made with Aristobulus to free his wife and his kids. Since these were still in prison, after Hyrcanus lost the war in Jericho to his brother, he runs over to Jerusalem and goes into the fortress, which was later known as Antonia, where Aristobulus' wife and children were being held. They came to an agreement before things should come to extremities that Aristobulus should be king and Hyrcanus should resign that up, but retained all the rest of the dignities as being the king's brother. Hereupon they were reconciled to each other in the temple and embraced one another in a very kind manner, while the people stood around about them. They also changed their houses, while Aristobulus went to the royal palace. Hyrcanus retired to the house of Aristobulus. So, they were brothers after all. The prisoners were still Hyrcanus' family. They were his sister-in-law, his nephews, his nieces. So they temporarily made a peace agreement. Hyrcanus refused to his title of king and recognized his brother as such. Aristobulus would then still consider Hyrcanus as a high priest. Hyrcanus, who had up to now been living in the palace, moved out, gave the palace to Aristobulus as a new king, and Aristobulus gave his house to Hyrcanus. Now, those other people which were at variance with Aristobulus were afraid upon his unexpected obtaining of the government, and especially this concerned Antipater, whom Aristobulus hated of old. Now that Aristobulus got power, a lot of people started worrying because Aristobulus had made a lot of enemies. Now, also, Alexander Salome had participated in the Mithridatic Wars, which I'm not going to go into what they were at this moment because of time. And one of those enemies of Alexander Salome was Antipater, who was also an enemy of Aristobulus. Now, seeing this problem that was going on, this rivalry between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, Antipater decides to do something. Mind you, it is important that I clarify one thing as well. This Antipater would then become the father of the now despised figure we now know as Herod the Great. So this is Antipater here. Herod's father is the one who's instigating. You see, the civil war was starting. Aristobulus and Hyrcanus found a way of making peace amongst themselves. But Antipater, Herod's father, decides to instigate more problems. Now we see where Herod gets his conniving nature from. He was by birth an Idumean, meaning that he was not a Jew. He was later considered a Jew because during the time of the great Maccabee uprising, all the regions around Israel, including the Idumean, the region of Idumea, which is later called, which was previously called Edom, which is pretty much now the border between Israel and Arabia and Jordan. That's where Antipater was from, and he was forced to convert to Judaism. Having this happened now, he does have some hatred against Alexander Salome, and he now starts conniving to try and manipulate some schemes so that he could rise to power. On account of his ancestors and riches and all other authority to him belonging, he also persuaded Hyrcanus to fly to Aretas, king of Arabia, and to lay claim to the kingdom. So here's what's going on. Antipater is married to Aretas' brother. This is Aretas III. Remember, in the past, there was a battle. Alexander Salome had fought against Obodas. Obodas was Aretas' brother. Obodas died, giving Aretas control of the kingdom. But Obodas and Aretas, they also had a sister. And this sister was married to Antipater. Now, Antipater wants to get rid of Aristobulus. And he notices one thing. He notices that Aristobulus' main enemy is his own brother Hyrcanus. So Antipater comes to Hyrcanus, and taking advantage of his connection, he refers them to his brother-in-law, Aretas III, so that Aretas could support Hyrcanus in reclaiming the kingdom. And exhorted Aretas to receive him and told him how becoming and a feeling it would be for him who ruled so great a kingdom to afford his assistance to such as are injured, alleging that Hyrcanus was treated unjustly by being deprived of that dominion which belonged to him by the prerogative of his birth. You see, Hyrcanus was the older of the two brothers. So by birthright, He was the firstborn, so the kingdom belonged to him, and it was stolen by Aristobulus. This was a claim that Antipater was making to Aretas, his brother-in-law. Uh, and he's trying to make his brother-in-law think that by helping Hyrcanus, he would be making fame for being such a kingdom that would establish justice among other nations. When he got predisposed them both to do what he would have them, he took Hyrcanus by night and ran away from the city. And continuing his flight with great swiftness, he escaped to a place called Petra, which is the royal seat of the king of Arabia. Petra is now a little southeast. That was the capital of the Nabateans, the capital of the Arabian kingdom. So first he spoke to Hyrcanus, convincing Hyrcanus to speak to Aretas. Then he spoke to Aretas, convincing him to receive Hyrcanus. Once they both were agreeing to meet with each other, he goes back to Jerusalem, picks up Hyrcanus, and brings them over to Aretas, over to the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, where he put Hyrcanus into Aretas' hand, and by discoursing much with him and getting upon him with his many presents, he prevailed with him to give him an army that might restore his kingdom. In other words, Aretas is granting Hyrcanus mercenaries to help him fight. This army consisted of 50,000 footmen and horsemen, against which Aristobulus was not able to make resistance, but was deserted in his first onset and was driven to Jerusalem. So now, confident of the support of the Nabatean army, Hyrcanus attacks his brother Aristobulus so that he could reclaim the kingdom. And for a long while, Hyrcanus is winning. Aristobulus is in the losing side, so Aristobulus runs away and hides among the many places Jerusalem has where he could hide. That is where Aristobulus could hide. Let's see, where was he? He also had taken at first by force if Scarus, the Roman general, had not come and seasonably interposed himself and raised the siege. The Scarus was sent into Syria from Armenia by Pompey the Great when he fought against Tigranes, so Scarus came to Damascus. Now we're talking about the year 64. During that time while the civil war was going on between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, the Romans were fighting what was called the Mithridatic War, which was finished in the year 64. That year, Scaurus comes to Damascus, and both brothers decide to send speakers to send an embassy to help them. So now Scaurus' decision had to make the decision who he was to help. Aristobulus decided to help, or I should say, Scaurus decided to help Aristobulus because Aristobulus sent sent $400 to bribe Scaurus for his help. So now Scaurus comes from Damascus in the year 64, heads down to Jerusalem, where the Nabatean army had Jerusalem surrounded. They were about to give the final blow to finally defeat Aristobulus. But Aristobulus is helped at the last minute by the forces of Scaurus. This, my brothers and sisters, is the way the Romans entered into Israel. This is a moment in which Rome starts taking possession slowly from Israel. Because of this civil war between Antiochus and Aristobulus, and Aristobulus invites Scaurus to attack Jerusalem. Aristobulus allies himself with the Romans, much for the sad result of what was to happen afterwards. Now the Romans come, they attack the Nabateans, who, together with their cannons, were about to finally conquer Jerusalem and restore the kingdom to Hyrcanus. Aristobulus gets reinforcements from Scaurus, which come and threaten the Nabateans. And they tell the Nabateans, withdraw and go back to Petra and leave Jerusalem alone, or we will attack you and Petra. Mind you, Scaurus had just arrived from having won the Mithridatic War. So they decide to abandon Hyrcanus' plea and they go back to Nabatea. So Scaurus came to Damascus, which had been lately taken by Metellus and Lollius, and caused them to leave the place. And upon hearing how the affair of Judea stood, he made haste thither as to a certain booty. As soon as therefore as he was in the country, there came an ambassador from both the brothers, each of them desiring his assistance. But Aristobulus' 300 talents had more weight with him than the justice of the cause. So Scaurus was not interested in that a king had been dethroned and was trying to take his city back. He was more interested in private gain. When Scaurus had received, he sent a herald to Hyrcanus and the Arabians and Nabateans and threatened them with the resentment of the Romans and Pompey unless they would raise the siege. So Aretas was terrified. Aretas, the king of the Nabateans, and retired out of Judea to Philadelphia, as did Scaurus returned to Damascus again. So since the Nabateans listened to the threat and left Aristobulus alone, abandoning Hyrcanus, Scaurus decides to go back to Damascus. Nor was Aristobulus satisfied with escaping out of his brother's hands, but gathered all his forces together and pursued enemies. He fought them at a place called Papyron and slew 6,000 of them, and together with him Antipater's brother Thalion. So now Aristobulus was angry at Antipater because Antipater had taken sides and convinced his brother Hyrcanus to fight to get back the throne. So Aristobulus feels threatened by Antipater, so he kills Antipater's brother Thalion for revenge. When Hyrcanus and Antipater were thus deprived of their hold from the Arabians, they transferred the same to their adversaries. And because Pompey had passed through Syria and was come to Damascus, this is the year 64 BC, they fled from him for assistance, and without any bribes, they made the same equitable pleas that they had used to Aretas, and besought him to hate the violent behavior of Aristobulus, and to bestow the kingdom on him whom it justly belonged. So, first battle, Aristobulus won. Hyrcanus gave the kingdom. Second battle, Hyrcanus was winning with the help of the Nabateans, but Scaurus comes to help the army of Aristobulus. Then there's another attempt now. Now, Antipater goes up to talk with Pompey, who was Scaurus' boss, Pompey being one of the leaders of the Roman Republic shortly before it became an empire. Now, Antipater uses the same speech he told Aretas to convince Pompey to support Hyrcanus instead of Aristobulus. By this time, Pompey, this is about a year after Scaurus had accepted the bribe that Aristobulus sent him. So Pompey finds out that it wasn't only Aristobulus, but many other people had out to the habit of bribing Scaurus. And because Scaurus was so um, much afraid of accepting bribes, Scaurus lost his job. This is the reason why Hyrcanus decides to talk to Pompey and seeks support in trying to overthrow his brother Aristobulus and get back the kingdom. According to other historians, Pompey decided not to answer neither of the two brothers first. He first wanted to get rid of the Nabateans and was on his way to attack Petra, the capital of the Nabateans. But Aristobulus saw the fact that he was not responded as a sign of hatred towards him. So he got angry and started getting ready to attack Pompey's forces. This made Pompey decide to support Hyrcanus instead. Let's continue. Where was I? And they besought him to go. They were trying to convince Pompey to give the kingdom back to Hyrcanus by snatching it away from Aristobulus. And both on account of his good character and account of his superiority in age. However, neither was Aristobulus wanting to himself in this case, as relying on the bribes that Scaurus had received. He was also there himself and adorning himself after a manner most agreeable to your royalty that he was able. But he soon thought it beneath him to come to in such a servile manner, and could not endure to serve his own ends in a way so much more abject than he was used to. So he departed from Diospolis. At this behavior, Pompey had great indignation. So Pompey felt that Aristobulus' behavior was unacceptable. Hyrcanus also and his friends made great intercessions to Pompey, so he took not only his Roman forces, but many of his Syrian auxiliaries and marched against Aristobulus. So now, Pompey, having come victorious from the Mithridatic wars, gets not only his army, but the other armies that came with him to the Mithridatic wars. And they attack Aristobulus. Remember, these forces were fresh from having been victorious in another practically type of world war that had taken place. But when he had passed by Pella and Scythopolis, that's in the northern part of the Jordan River, that's just south of the Sea of Galilee, and was come to Coria, where you enter into the Judean kingdom. That means he had not only passed the aforementioned Scythopolis, but they were also now past the region of Samaria. When you go up to it through the Mediterranean parts, he heard that Aristobulus was fled to Alexandrium, where he was trying to prepare for war. It's a stronghold fortified with the utmost magnificence and situated upon a high mountain. And he sent to him and commanded him to come down. Now his inclination was to try his fortune in battle, since he was called in such an imperious manner, rather than to comply with the call. However, he saw the multitude were in great fear, and his friends exhorted him to consider taking the government. He returned to the fortress where the power of the Romans was and how irresistible he complied with the advice I gave him down with Pompey. And when he had made a long apology for himself and for the justice of his cause in taking the government, he returned to the fortress. In other words, Pompey was planning on ignoring the call. Aristobulus was planning on ignoring the call of Pompey. But his people, his soldiers, and his friends were all afraid because the Roman army that was now with Pompey supporting Hyrcanus was so large that Aristobulus' army had no match. So Aristobulus heats, goes down, explains his situation to Pompey. He came down and spoke, but yeah, we saw that, right? So he was between hope and fear. And when he came down, it was to prevail with Pompey to allow him the government entirely. And when he went up to the citadel, this citadel, remember, is a palace north of the temple. It was that he might not appear to debase himself too low. However, Pompey commanded him to give up his fortified places and forced him to write to every one of their governors to yield them up, they having had this charge given them, to obey no letters but what were of his own handwriting. Accordingly, he did what he was ordered to do, but had still an indignation at what was done, and retired to Jerusalem and prepared to fight with Pompey. So now, Pompey comes supporting and defending and Hyrcanus. Aristobulus' army is too afraid to confront Pompey's army. So now Pompey orders Aristobulus to leave the palace and leave all these fortresses back in the hands of Hyrcanus. So Aristobulus complies. But all along he was hoping to find another opportunity to continue and finally attack Pompey and his army. But guess what? But Pompey did not give him time to make any preparations for a siege, but followed him at his heels. He was also obliged to make haste in his attempt by the death of Mithridates, of which he was informed about Jericho. Now, here is the most fruitful country of Judea, which bears vast number of palm trees besides the balsam tree. So now, Pompey comes at the fortress in Alexandria, orders Aristobulus to give Alexandrium to Hyrcanus. So Aristobulus follows instructions, gives Alexandrium over to Hyrcanus, and retreats to Jerusalem. Aristobulus was planning that once he arrived in Jerusalem, he would make plans to attack Pompey. But Pompey did not give him any chances for that matter, because as soon as Aristobulus left the Alexandrium, Pompey knew that Aristobulus would have something up his hands. So Pompey decided to continue, even though he had defeated Aristobulus. Pompey wanted to continue and chased Aristobulus all the way to Jerusalem and laid siege to Jerusalem without giving Aristobulus a chance to prepare. The whole idea was to destroy Aristobulus' army once and for all before Aristobulus could do anything against Pompey or to retake power against his brother Hyrcanus. And then when Flavius Josephus then decides to move on and starts talking about the wonderful plants and animals that are around Judea. Sprouts they cut up with sharp stones, and the incisions they gather the juice, which drops down like tears. So Pompey pitched his camp in that place one night, and then hasted away the next morning to Jerusalem. But Aristobulus was so frightened at this approach that he came and met him by way of supplication. He also promised him money, and that he would deliver up both himself and the city into his disposal, and thereby mitigated the anger of Pompey. Since Pompey did not give Aristobulus any chance to to make preparations to attack him, Aristobulus realized he would not be able to attack Pompey the way he wanted to. So he realized he had no choice but to give up right then and there. Aristobulus realized he has no hope against Pompey. So he hands over the kingdom of Jerusalem, the kingdom of the Maccabees, to Pompey. And there, my brothers and sisters, that is the way the Maccabees fell. At this point, the Maccabees officially become no more than mere puppets of the Roman Empire. At this time, Aristobulus, afraid of being destroyed him with his army, they end up doing the worst betrayal, handing the entire kingdom of Israel in the hands of the Romans. Now, this is how the Romans take power over Israel. But yet, Pompey, knowing that he had the power right now, he decides to only partially stick to his promise. He does not stick to his full promise, just a partial fulfillment of the promises. You see, Pompey had promised to support to support Hyrcanus and place Hyrcanus as king of Jerusalem once Aristobulus was defeated. Now, Aristobulus is finally defeated, but Pompey now owns Jerusalem. Let's see what happened after it. Yet did not he perform any of the conditions he had agreed to, for Aristobulus' party would not so much as admit Gabinius into the city, who was sent to receive the money that he had promised. Wait. So the conquest wasn't complete yet. Pompey comes. Aristobulus feels threatened and goes out, promises to hand over Jerusalem along with tribute. But when Pompey finally comes to take over Jerusalem, they block him at the entrance. Now, Pompey is not allowed to go inside. He is once again blocked by Aristobulus' people, causing then the city to be put in siege. And here, brothers and sisters, is where we see the beginning of the fall of the Maccabean kingdom. As always, long live Christ the King!